Before millions across Africa carried his image through the streets, before powerful governments feared his voice, Thomas Sankara was just a poor boy born in a forgotten African nation that the world barely cared about. But in only 4 years, he would become one of the most dangerous men in Africa. This is not just the story of a president. This is the story of a revolution. A story of courage, betrayal, power, sacrifice, and an impossible dream that terrified the powerful. In this video, you will discover how Thomas Sankara rose from a quiet child in colonial Africa to become the youngest president of Burkina Faso, and why his ideas shook an entire continent. You will witness how he rejected luxury while other leaders lived like kings. How he slashed corruption fearlessly. How he vaccinated millions of children, empowered women, transformed agriculture, planted millions of trees, and challenged foreign powers directly to their faces. You will see why many Africans called him the people's president, and why others wanted him silenced forever. But this story goes even deeper. Because behind the speeches and revolutionary ideas was a growing storm of betrayal. Friends became enemies, allies turned against him, and hidden forces began moving in the shadows. Who really ordered the assassination of Thomas Sankara? Was it political betrayal from within? Foreign powers protecting their interests? Or was Sankara simply too honest to survive in a corrupt system? This video uncovers the rise, achievements, enemies, assassination theories, and immortal legacy of the man many still call Africa's greatest revolutionary leader. And by the end of this story, you will understand why, decades after his death, Thomas Sankara is still inspiring millions around the world. This is the revolution they killed, the untold story behind Thomas Sankara's assassination. In the heart of West Africa, in a land scorched by the sun and hardened by poverty, a boy was born who would one day shake the conscience of an entire continent. That boy was Thomas Sankara. Long before the world called him Africa's Che Guevara, before crowds chanted his name in the streets, and before powerful enemies feared his voice, Thomas Sankara was simply a quiet child growing up in the dusty town of Yako, in what was then known as Upper Volta. The year was 1949. Africa was still chained under colonial rule. European powers controlled the wealth, the land, and even the future of millions of Africans. In Upper Volta, French influence dominated everyday life. The poor struggled to survive while foreign powers benefited from the country's resources. Most people accepted suffering as normal. Many believed nothing would ever change. But young Thomas saw the world differently. He was born into a modest Catholic family. His father had served in the French colonial army, a path many Africans took simply to survive. Discipline shaped the household, but so did humility. Thomas grew up witnessing hardship firsthand. He saw farmers work endlessly only to remain poor. He saw ordinary people treated as though their lives carried little value. Even as a child, he hated injustice. Unlike many boys his age, Thomas was unusually thoughtful. He listened more than he spoke. He questioned everything. Why were some people rich while others starved? Why did Africans obey foreign systems that kept them weak? Why were leaders comfortable while their people suffered? These questions burned inside him long before he ever entered politics. At school, Thomas quickly stood out. He was intelligent, disciplined, and fiercely determined. Teachers recognized his brilliance early. Yet intelligence alone did not define him. What made him different was his refusal to accept humiliation. One story from his youth captured the spirit that would later define him. A colonial authority figure once treated local Africans with open disrespect, speaking to them as if they were children. Most people lowered their heads in silence. Fear had become part of life, but Thomas could not hide his anger. Even as a young boy, he despised the sight of Africans being stripped of dignity in their own homeland. That fire inside him only grew stronger. As he entered his teenage years, Sankara developed another passion: music. He loved jazz and played the guitar with remarkable talent. Music became more than entertainment to him. It became expression. Rhythm gave voice to emotions he could not yet fully explain: anger, hope, rebellion, and freedom. But fate was preparing him for a different stage. Because of his academic discipline, Thomas was eventually sent to military school. To many people, the military represented power and obedience. But to Sankara, it became something else entirely, a pathway to change. At military academy, he studied not only warfare but also politics, history, and revolutionary philosophy. He read deeply about anti-colonial movements across Africa and beyond. He admired leaders who stood against oppression. He became fascinated by revolutions that empowered ordinary people instead of wealthy elites. While many soldiers trained to follow orders blindly, Sankara trained his mind. He began to understand a painful truth: Africa's greatest enemy was not only foreign control, but also African leaders who betrayed their own people. This realization transformed him. During his military training in Madagascar, Sankara witnessed massive political uprisings by poor citizens demanding justice. For the first time, he saw ordinary people challenge an unjust system openly. He saw courage overpower fear. He saw that governments were not untouchable. Those events changed his life forever. Thomas Sankara returned home no longer thinking like an ordinary soldier. He now carried the mindset of a revolutionary. He believed Africa could rise. He believed corruption could be defeated. He believed leaders should live like the people they served, not above them. And most dangerously of all, he believed the poor deserved power. At the time, few realized what was coming. To many, he was just another young officer with unusual ideas. But history was already moving beneath the surface. The quiet boy from Yako was preparing to become the voice of a continent. And one day, the world would remember his name. Before Thomas Sankara rose to power, Upper Volta went through years of political instability, military coups, economic hardship, and leadership struggles. The road from independence to Sankara's revolution was filled with disappointment, unrest, and growing frustration among ordinary citizens. When Upper Volta gained independence from France on August 5, 1960, the country's first president became Maurice Yamiogo. At first, many people were hopeful. Independence symbolized freedom from colonial rule and the beginning of self-governance. But problems quickly emerged. Yamiogo established a highly centralized government and gradually moved toward one-party rule. Opposition voices were weakened, political freedoms declined, and economic difficulties worsened. The country remained extremely poor, and many citizens felt independence had changed little in their daily lives. By the mid-1960s, dissatisfaction exploded. Workers, students, and trade unions organized massive protests against corruption, economic hardship, and authoritarian leadership. Then, in January 1966, the military intervened. President Yamiogo was overthrown in Upper Volta's first military coup. After the coup, military officer Sangal Lamazana took power. Lamazana initially gained support because many citizens hoped military rule would restore order and reduce corruption. Unlike Yamiogo, Lamazana attempted a more moderate style of leadership. Over time, he introduced limited civilian participation and tried balancing military authority with democratic reforms. However, Upper Volta still struggled economically. Droughts, poverty, weak infrastructure, and dependence on foreign aid continued damaging the country. Political instability remained constant beneath the surface. Although Lamazana stayed in power for 14 years, frustration steadily grew among both civilians and younger military officers. Many believed the country was moving too slowly and failing to solve its deep social and economic problems. By the 1970s, Upper Volta remained one of the poorest nations in the world. The country was rich in hard-working people, but its citizens lived under crushing poverty. Villages lacked clean water. Hunger haunted families. Corruption poisoned the government. While ordinary people struggled daily, politicians lived comfortably behind walls guarded by soldiers. To many, this was simply how life worked. But not to Thomas Sankara. Now a young military officer, Sankara had become known for something unusual: integrity. In a system where many officers chased status and privilege, Sankara lived simply. He avoided arrogance. He spoke openly with ordinary citizens. He listened to farmers, workers, and students. Unlike powerful men who surrounded themselves with luxury, Sankara spent time understanding the suffering of the people. This made him different and dangerous. As Sankara rose through the military ranks, he built close friendships with other young officers who shared his frustration with corruption and foreign influence. Among them was Blaise Compaore, a man who would later become both his closest ally and his greatest betrayal. At the time, however, they appeared united by a common dream. Together, these young officers believed their nation needed radical change. They were tired of leaders who served foreign interests while their own people starved. They wanted dignity for Africa. They wanted self-reliance. They wanted a government that belonged to the people instead of the elite. Sankara's charisma quickly began attracting attention. He spoke with rare conviction. His speeches were fiery but intelligent. He criticized greed openly, even when powerful figures stood nearby. Unlike politicians who carefully protected their careers, Sankara seemed unafraid of consequences. People started listening. Young citizens especially admired him. Students saw him as honest. Workers saw him as one of them. Soldiers respected his discipline and courage. Even those who disagreed with him could not ignore the passion in his voice. Then came the conflict that made him a national hero. In 1974, a border war erupted between Upper Volta and neighboring Mali. Though the conflict was brief, Sankara distinguished himself through courage and leadership during combat operations. When he returned home, many expected him to enjoy fame quietly and rise comfortably within the military system. But Sankara had no interest in becoming comfortable. Instead, he became more vocal than ever. He openly criticized corruption inside government institutions. He condemned leaders who depended too heavily on foreign powers. He challenged the idea that African nations should beg wealthy countries for survival. To Sankara, dependence was another form of slavery. His ideas were revolutionary and deeply threatening to the political establishment. Still, his popularity continued to grow. Then another coup came. In 1980, Colonel Say Zerbo overthrew Lamizana. Zerbo justified the coup by claiming the government had become ineffective and incapable of solving national problems. But his leadership quickly faced difficulties. Trade unions opposed him. Political freedoms became restricted again. Economic frustrations deepened. And within the military itself, divisions began growing. His government failed to unite the country or stabilize the political environment. Only 2 years later, another coup removed him from power. In 1982, Major Jean-Baptiste Ouedraogo became president after another military takeover. This period became extremely important because it marked the national rise of Thomas Sankara. Ouedraogo's government included both conservatives and young revolutionary officers who wanted radical transformation. Among the revolutionary figures, Sankara stood out immediately. He was appointed Prime Minister in 1983. And suddenly, the entire country began paying attention to him. Sankara's speeches electrified young people, workers, and students. He openly criticized corruption, imperialism, and foreign dependency. He spoke about dignity, self-reliance, and revolutionary change. But his popularity alarmed conservative leaders inside the government and worried foreign powers, especially France. Many feared Sankara's growing influence. Then tensions exploded. Under pressure from conservative forces, President Ouedraogo removed Sankara from office and placed him under house arrest in 1983. This decision triggered outrage across the country. Supporters protested. Young military officers became furious. And among those determined to free Sankara was his close ally, Blaise Compaore. Sankara's growing anti-imperialist ideas alarmed those who benefited from Africa's dependence. They feared that if he gained real power, he would inspire other African nations to reject foreign control as well. The government believed imprisoning him would silence the movement forming around him. Instead, it ignited the nation. Across the country, protests erupted demanding his release. Citizens poured into the streets. Soldiers loyal to Sankara became restless. Anger spread rapidly. The authorities had made a terrible mistake. By imprisoning Thomas Sankara, they had transformed him from a popular officer into a national symbol of resistance. And soon, Upper Volta would never be the same again. The prison walls could not contain the idea that Thomas Sankara had become. By 1983, anger was boiling across Upper Volta. Young people were tired of corruption. Workers were exhausted by poverty. Soldiers loyal to Sankara believed the government had betrayed the nation. And deep beneath the tension, a revolution was taking shape. On August 4, 1983, revolutionary soldiers loyal to Sankara carried out a coup that brought him to power. At just 33 years old, Thomas Sankara became president. For many citizens, this felt completely different from previous military takeovers. Earlier coups had mainly focused on replacing leaders. Many foreign observers assumed he would become just another African military ruler, another man who would give speeches about change before enriching himself like countless others. But Sankara was different. Almost immediately, he began doing things no one expected. From 1983 to 1987, Sankara attempted something many believed impossible, transforming one of the poorest nations on earth into a country driven by dignity, discipline, and self-reliance. And he did it at breathtaking speed. When Sankara took power, Upper Volta faced devastating poverty. Illiteracy was widespread. Villages lacked roads, clean water, schools, and healthcare. Corruption had drained public trust. Foreign dependence weakened the economy. Most leaders would have blamed history. Sankara chose action. He once declared, "A soldier without political education is a potential criminal." To Sankara, leadership was not about comfort. It was about sacrifice. Then came the decision that stunned the world. Sankara announced that Upper Volta would no longer carry its colonial name. The country would now be called Burkina Faso. The name combined words from local African languages meaning land of upright people. It was more than a name change. It was a declaration of identity. Sankara wanted Africans to stop seeing themselves through the eyes of former colonial powers. He believed dignity began with reclaiming culture, pride, and independence. For the first time, millions felt their nation truly belonged to them. But Sankara was only getting started. Unlike leaders who spent years making promises, he moved with extraordinary speed. One of his greatest priorities was healthcare. At the time, diseases such as measles, meningitis, and yellow fever were killing thousands of children across the country. Sankara launched one of Africa's most ambitious vaccination campaigns. In an astonishing effort, millions of children were vaccinated within a short period. International observers were stunned by the scale and speed of the operation. For countless families, it meant children who would finally survive. But Sankara understood that health alone could not free a nation. Education became another battlefield. Schools were expanded into rural communities where many children had never entered a classroom before. Literacy campaigns encouraged both children and adults to learn reading and writing. Sankara believed knowledge was essential for liberation. He once declared, "The enemies of a people are ignorance, superstition, and fear." And so he attacked ignorance directly. At the same time, he pushed for massive infrastructure projects. Roads and railways were developed using local labor. Communities were encouraged to work collectively to improve their own villages. Instead of waiting for foreign contractors, citizens themselves participated in building the nation. This created something rare, national pride. For the first time, many people felt they were not merely surviving inside Burkina Faso, they were helping shape it. Sankara also focused heavily on agriculture. He believed no country could be truly independent while relying on others for food. He once said, "He who feeds you controls you." Farmers were encouraged to increase local production. Land reforms weakened the power of feudal structures that exploited rural communities. He publicly rejected foreign food aid like flour, wheat, bread, milk, butter, and other finished products. He urged that his country was full of hard-working people, and if anyone was willing to help Burkina Faso, they instead helped them with equipments that can help them increase their food production, such as tractors, manure, insecticides, irrigation equipments, among others. The results were extraordinary. Within a few years, Burkina Faso dramatically increased food production and moved closer toward food self-sufficiency. In a region often associated with famine and dependency, Sankara proved progress was possible. But perhaps his most revolutionary achievements involved women. At a time when many leaders avoided challenging traditional gender systems, Sankara openly declared that women's liberation was necessary for national liberation. His government banned forced marriages and worked against female genital mutilation. Women were appointed into leadership positions. Girls were encouraged to attend school. Women joined the military and government institutions in larger numbers than ever before. Sankara even organized symbolic actions to challenge gender inequality. On one occasion, he encouraged men to go to marketplaces and experience the daily burdens women carried. He wanted society to understand that women's struggles were not invisible labor to be ignored. These actions shocked conservative circles, but they inspired many ordinary citizens. Sankara also fought environmental destruction long before climate issues became global headlines. He launched major tree planting campaigns to stop the expansion of the Sahara Desert. He understood that environmental collapse would worsen poverty and hunger. His thinking was years ahead of its time. Then there was his war against corruption. Sankara believed leaders should serve, not rule. Government officials were forbidden from displaying excessive luxury. Expensive first-class flights and lavish spending were reduced. He sold off luxury government cars and replaced them with cheaper alternatives. Ministers were expected to live modestly. Even Sankara himself lived simply. He owned few personal possessions. His salary remained modest. Unlike many rulers who enriched themselves after taking power, Sankara appeared determined to prove that leadership did not require greed. This made him beloved among the poor, but deeply hated among elites. Because Sankara's revolution threatened more than corruption inside Burkina Faso. It threatened an entire mindset. He was showing Africans that a leader could reject luxury, that a nation could challenge dependency, that ordinary citizens could participate in rebuilding their country, and that frightened many powerful people. By the mid-1980s, Sankara's image had spread far beyond Burkina Faso. Across Africa and even internationally, he was increasingly viewed as one of the continent's boldest revolutionary leaders. Some called him a visionary, others called him reckless. But almost everyone agreed on one thing: Thomas Sankara was changing history. And history was beginning to fight back. Unlike many presidents who quietly cooperated with powerful foreign interests, Sankara openly challenged global systems he believed exploited Africa. He criticized Western economic control. He condemned foreign debt. He attacked corruption with fearless intensity. At international conferences, Sankara spoke with a confidence that shocked older African leaders. He accused wealthy nations of benefiting from Africa's suffering while pretending to offer help. Many leaders avoided such confrontations. Sankara welcomed them. In one of his most famous speeches before African leaders, he warned that foreign debt had become a weapon used to keep African nations trapped in dependency. He declared, "Debt cannot be repaid because if we don't pay, lenders will not die. But if we pay, we will die." The room fell silent. Some leaders admired his courage privately. Others feared he was going too far. Because Sankara was not merely criticizing systems. He was encouraging Africans to resist them. Meanwhile, inside Burkina Faso, his reforms continued transforming the nation at remarkable speed. Under his leadership, millions of trees were planted to fight desertification. Agricultural production improved significantly. Government waste was reduced. Public health campaigns saved countless lives. Perhaps most importantly, people began believing in themselves again. Sankara wanted Africans to stop viewing poverty as destiny. He encouraged citizens to wear locally made clothing instead of imported foreign fashion. He promoted African culture proudly. He urged the population to build the nation with their own hands rather than wait for outside rescue. To supporters, he was awakening dignity. To critics, he was creating instability. But behind the scenes, pressure against him was intensifying. Foreign governments watched him closely. Powerful business interests disliked his economic ideas. Some neighboring African leaders worried his revolutionary message might spread into their own countries. And within his own circle, resentment quietly grew. Many officials who had supported the revolution enjoyed power more than sacrifice. They liked the idea of revolution until Sankara's strict principles threatened their comfort. Some began seeing him not as an inspiration, but as an obstacle. Among those who saw him in that view was Blaise Compaore. Tensions grew silently, yet Sankara appeared unconcerned. Even as threats surrounded him, he continued speaking boldly. Friends warned him to be careful. He refused. He believed fear was the greatest prison of all. One day, during a meeting, Sankara reportedly said something chilling. While revolutionaries as individuals can be murdered, you cannot kill ideas. It was a statement filled with conviction. But it would soon become prophecy. By 1987, whispers of conspiracy spread through the political elite. Secret discussions were taking place behind closed doors. Loyalty inside the government was beginning to fracture. And Sankara, despite all his intelligence, was becoming increasingly isolated. Still, he carried on. He continued addressing the people. He continued fighting corruption. He continued dreaming of a self-reliant Africa. Many conservative figures were outraged. But Sankara refused to back down. He believed no nation could become truly free while half its population remained oppressed. As his popularity grew among ordinary people, so did hatred against him among powerful interests. Corrupt politicians despised him. Foreign powers distrusted him. Wealthy elites feared him. Even some of his closest allies began feeling uncomfortable with his radical vision. Because Sankara demanded honesty not only from enemies, but from friends as well. He criticized greed relentlessly. He expected discipline from everyone around him. He tolerated very little corruption, even within his inner circle. Slowly, cracks began forming beneath the revolution. And though millions admired Thomas Sankara, dangerous enemies were gathering quietly in the shadows. Enemies who believed one thing with absolute certainty: if Sankara continued inspiring Africa, the old system might collapse forever. Not knowing that death was already moving toward him from within his own revolution. The greatest danger was no longer outside Burkina Faso. It was standing beside him. By 1987, Thomas Sankara stood at the height of his influence. To millions across Africa, he had become more than a president. He was proof that leadership could be honest. Young revolutionaries admired him passionately. Pan-African thinkers praised his courage. Students repeated his speeches in classrooms and streets. Even beyond Burkina Faso, his name carried growing power. But inside the government, the atmosphere was changing. The revolution that once seemed united was beginning to crack from within. Some officials had grown tired of Sankara's strict discipline. Others quietly resented his refusal to compromise. Many had joined the revolution expecting influence, privilege, and security, not endless sacrifice. Sankara demanded too much from them. He wanted integrity. He wanted accountability. He wanted leaders who would serve the people rather than enrich themselves. And not everyone shared that vision anymore. At the center of this growing tension stood Blaise Compaore. For years, Sankara and Compaore had appeared inseparable. They had risen together through the military. Together they had carried out the revolution of 1983. Sankara trusted him deeply, perhaps more than anyone else. But power changes people. While Sankara pushed for radical transformation, others around him began fearing instability. Some believed he was moving too aggressively against traditional structures. Others worried his confrontations with foreign powers were dangerous for the country's survival. And beyond Burkina Faso, powerful interests were watching carefully. Sankara's speeches against imperialism had angered influential governments. His criticism of foreign debt challenged international financial systems. His insistence on African self-reliance threatened those who benefited from dependency. He was admired by the poor, but feared by the powerful. Rumors of plots and conspiracies started circulating quietly in political circles. Friends warned Sankara repeatedly that enemies were gathering around him. Yet he refused to rule through fear. Unlike many leaders, Sankara did not surround himself with overwhelming security. He continued moving among ordinary people with relative openness. He believed excessive fear corrupted leaders and separated them from the citizens they served. But danger was closing in. Inside meetings, tensions became harder to hide. Some allies accused Sankara of isolating himself politically. Others believed the revolution needed to slow down and compromise with external powers. Sankara resisted fiercely. To him, compromise with corruption was surrender. He knew the revolution faced enemies, but he still believed loyalty existed among those closest to him. That belief would cost him everything. On October 15, 1987, Sankara attended a meeting at the Untold Council in the Burkina capital Ouagadougou. It seemed like an ordinary gathering among officials. Then gunfire erupted. Armed men stormed the building. Chaos exploded instantly. Witnesses later described panic, shouting, and confusion as bullets tore through the meeting hall. Sankara reportedly urged his colleagues not to resist. According to accounts that survived, his final words were calm but haunting, "It is me they want." Moments later, Thomas Sankara was shot and killed. He was only 37 years old. The revolution that had electrified Africa ended in blood. 12 other officials died alongside him. Sankara's body was reportedly buried quickly in a simple grave. Public mourning was tightly controlled. His image was pushed aside by the new regime. And almost immediately, the government announced that Blaise Compaore had taken power. The news stunned the nation. Many could not believe that Sankara, the man who had inspired so much hope, was gone. Others suspected betrayal immediately. Questions spread rapidly across Burkina Faso and beyond. Who truly ordered the assassination? Who benefited from his death? And how could a revolution built on brotherhood end with bullets fired from within? The assassination of Thomas Sankara did not only end a revolution. It created one of Africa's greatest political mysteries. For decades, questions surrounded the events of October 15, 1987. Official explanations were vague. Witnesses were silenced. Fear controlled public discussion. And for many years, the full truth remained buried beneath politics, secrecy, and power. But one thing became clear almost immediately: Thomas Sankara's death was not random. It was organized. The biggest question was simple: who ordered it? The immediate suspect, Blaise Compaore. The first and most widely discussed theory centered on Blaise Compaore. The reason was obvious. Within hours of Sankara's death, Compaore assumed power. He justified the takeover by claiming the revolution had lost direction and that relations between the two men had deteriorated. To many people, this explanation sounded suspicious. Compaore had been Sankara's closest ally for years. They had built the revolution together. Sankara trusted him deeply. Yet after the assassination, Compaore became the primary beneficiary of Sankara's removal. That alone fueled enormous suspicion. Over time, several former insiders and witnesses claimed the coup had been planned internally by members of the government and military who were unhappy with Sankara's leadership style and radical policies. Some believed Compaore feared Sankara's growing isolation of corrupt figures within the government. Others believed ideological differences between the two men had become impossible to repair. There were also reports that certain military officers believed Sankara's confrontational international policies could destabilize Burkina Faso politically and economically. Still, for years, concrete evidence remained difficult to access because Compaore ruled Burkina Faso for nearly 3 decades after Sankara's death. Under his government, investigations into the assassination were largely suppressed. That silence only deepened suspicion. Another major theory involved France. Sankara's fierce anti-imperialist speeches had alarmed many French political and economic interests in Africa. He openly criticized former colonial powers and encouraged African nations to reject dependency on Western influence. This made him extremely unpopular among certain foreign elites. Many supporters of Sankara believed France viewed him as a threat to its influence in West Africa. During the Cold War era, African leaders who challenged Western interests often faced political destabilization, coups, or foreign interference. However, direct public evidence proving French government involvement has remained limited and heavily debated. Some researchers argue there are patterns suggesting foreign intelligence awareness or indirect support for the coup. Others caution that no definitive evidence has fully proven official French orchestration. Still, the theory persists strongly because Sankara's ideology directly challenged long-standing French influence in the region. Some investigations and testimonies also pointed toward possible involvement from leaders in Ivory Coast. At the time, Sankara's revolutionary ideas worried several neighboring governments. Conservative African leaders feared that his popularity among young Africans could inspire unrest in their own countries. There were allegations that anti-Sankara networks operated across borders and may have assisted the coup politically or logistically. Again, many claims remained difficult to verify completely. But the regional political climate made such theories believable to many observers. Why Sankara was dangerous? To understand why Thomas Sankara may have been targeted, one must understand what made him different. He challenged corruption directly. He rejected dependence on foreign powers. He lived modestly instead of enriching himself. He empowered women. He inspired young Africans to think independently. And perhaps most threatening of all, he proved that radical change might actually be possible. That frightened many powerful people. Because if Sankara succeeded fully, millions across Africa could begin demanding the same kind of leadership in their own countries. And systems built on fear, corruption, and dependency cannot easily survive leaders like Thomas Sankara. After the assassination of Thomas Sankara, silence fell over Burkina Faso like a heavy storm cloud. Fear returned to the streets. The revolutionary songs grew quieter. The fiery speeches disappeared from the radio. Posters of Sankara vanished from public spaces. Under the new government led by Blaise Compaore, the nation entered a different era, one far less radical, far less confrontational, and far more acceptable to powerful international interests. For years, many people were too afraid to speak openly about Sankara. Some whispered his name privately inside homes, others kept his memory alive through stories passed from one generation to another. But publicly, discussing him could be dangerous. It was as though the revolution itself had been buried beside him. Yet something extraordinary began happening across Africa. The more authorities tried to erase Sankara's image, the larger it became. Young Africans who had been children during his presidency grew up hearing stories about a leader who refused luxury while his people suffered. Students discovered recordings of his speeches and were stunned by his courage. Activists admired the way he challenged corruption fearlessly. Women remembered how he defended their rights at a time when few leaders dared to do so openly. Slowly, Sankara transformed from former president into legend. His image began appearing on posters, murals, t-shirts, and protest banners across the continent. University students quoted him during demonstrations. Musicians referenced him in songs. Political thinkers studied his ideas about African independence and self-reliance. To many young Africans, Sankara became more than history. He became possibility, a reminder that leadership did not have to mean greed. A reminder that integrity was still possible in politics. And perhaps most importantly, a reminder that Africa could define its own future. Outside Africa, his reputation also continued growing. Writers compared him to revolutionary figures like Che Guevara because of his charisma, simplicity, and anti-imperialist beliefs. Others argued Sankara was unique, a leader shaped not by fantasy, but by the real struggles of African people. Unlike many revolutionaries who preached sacrifice while living comfortably, Sankara had actually lived the values he spoke about. That authenticity made him unforgettable. As years passed, more information about his government resurfaced. Researchers studied the rapid improvements made during his presidency. Citizens who had once remained silent began speaking openly again. Then came 2014. After ruling for 27 years, Blaise Compaore faced massive public protests in Burkina Faso. Citizens rose against attempts to extend his grip on power. And during those protests, one image appeared everywhere: Thomas Sankara. For many demonstrators, Sankara represented the opposite of everything they believed Compaore had become. Protesters carried portraits of the slain revolutionary through the streets as though history itself had returned, demanding justice. Eventually, Compaore fled the country. For countless Burkina citizens, the moment felt symbolic. The man accused of benefiting from Sankara's death was gone. Then came the trial that changed history. For decades, many believed the truth would never emerge. Then history shifted. After Compaore was overthrown in 2014 following mass protests in Burkina Faso, long-suppressed investigations into Sankara's assassination finally reopened. This was a turning point. Witnesses began speaking publicly. Documents resurfaced. Former officials were questioned. In 2021 and 2022, a military tribunal in Burkina Faso conducted a landmark trial related to Sankara's assassination. The court ultimately convicted Blaise Compaore in absentia for complicity in the assassination and attacks on state security. Several others were also convicted. For many supporters of Sankara, the ruling represented long-awaited recognition that the assassination had been an organized political act rather than an accident of history. Yet even after the verdict, debates continued. Some people believed the full network behind the assassination had still not been fully exposed. Others argued foreign involvement remained hidden. And some insisted the truth was larger than any single man. In February 2023, Thomas Sankara and his 12 companions were finally given an official national burial ceremony in Ouagadougou. The ceremony was attended by government officials, Sankara's family, African political figures, revolutionary supporters, thousands of ordinary citizens. Many people wore red berets and carried Sankara's portraits, revolutionary slogans, and Burkina flags. The atmosphere was emotional, patriotic, and deeply symbolic. The 13 coffins were draped in national colors and honored as heroes of the nation. For many citizens, this was not simply a funeral, it was the restoration of historical dignity. The official burial took place at the newly created Thomas Sankara Memorial Site in Ouagadougou. The memorial was designed to honor Sankara and the 12 officials killed alongside him. The site includes tombs of the victims, memorial structures, spaces for reflection and historical remembrance, revolutionary symbolism connected to Sankara's vision for Africa. To this day, the memorial has become an important national and Pan-African symbol. Thomas Sankara entered power with almost nothing. No vast fortune. No powerful dynasty behind him. No empire protecting him. Only ideas. Ideas about dignity. Ideas about justice. Ideas about an Africa that could rise without begging the world for permission. In just 4 years, he challenged corruption, inspired millions, empowered women, fought poverty, rejected luxury, and dared to tell Africans that they were capable of shaping their own destiny. That courage made him loved by the people, and feared by the powerful. His enemies succeeded in taking his life on October 15, 1987. But they failed at something far more important. They failed to erase him. Because some leaders rule through fear and disappear when they die, others rule through truth and become immortal. Decades after his assassination, the name Thomas Sankara still echoes through African streets, classrooms, protests, and conversations about hope. Young generations who were not even born during his presidency still wear his image proudly, still study his speeches, and still wonder what Africa might have become if he had lived longer. Perhaps that is the greatest proof of his impact. Not the titles he held, not the power he possessed, but the fact that long after his death, people still believe. They still believe honest leadership is possible. They still believe Africa can stand independently. And they still believe one courageous person can challenge an entire system. Thomas Sankara once said, "While revolutionaries as individuals can be murdered, you cannot kill ideas." History proved him right. Because the man was buried. But the revolution never truly died. That's the inspirational story of Thomas Sankara. If this story inspired you, remember to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories about the people who changed history against impossible odds. As we learn from the past and tell these stories, don't forget to protect our planet. Avoid any improper disposal of wastes like plastics and oil into natural water bodies and on land. If we protect our home, our future is safe.